Welcome back to our second video tutorial for Intro to Programming. Today we're going to look at, I think we're going to continue from where we stopped from the previous video, where I think we've already created a base application for the calculator. So I'll just go ahead and load my Visual Studio. And I'll go to File and try and open. I think I'll just go to Recent Projects and Solutions. Now under the Recent Projects and Solutions, I'll see the recent projects and solutions I've worked on recently, and I think I remember it's this Smart Calc with a K and a K. So I'll just click that to load it up. And I think I can see my Windows properties window is not showing. Okay, that's it, it's back now. What else? I think I'll have to double click on the forms to bring it up. Okay, it comes up by itself, so that's good. So this is our design view for our form, and so far this is what we've had. I think we can click play and run it. We tested this in the previous video and everything works fine. So now the next thing we're going to look at is, if you notice the calculator application we're trying to create, it just a bunch of buttons and a text box at the top. Let me just bring it out to show what I'm trying to explain. Let's look for Microsoft Calculator. So this is it. So this is the app we're trying to replicate, but I think I explained in the class that we're not going to put any menus, so we're going to eliminate this. We're going to have this text box, and we're not going to bother about putting in all these buttons. We'll just have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we'll have a plus, a minus, a multiplication, an equal sign, and probably a CE button for kind of resetting the input box or the text box. So this is what we expect to create at the end of the course. So I'll just close that. So like we saw in the calculator, it has a few buttons and a text box. Now the first thing I'll do is to add the text box on the form. Now to do that, you go to your toolbox. Now it is possible that you probably don't have this toolbox displaying here like this. I've just closed mine and you can see there's no toolbox on the left. Now if you want to bring it back, you just go to view, the view menu, and you click on toolbox, and you see the toolbox comes back. And at the moment you can click, if you notice there's a little rectangle that gets highlighted on the left. If you go on it, if you click on it, the toolbox shows, and if you click back on it, the toolbox goes back. So just take note of that in case you're looking for toolbox. That's where you can find it. So now your toolbox has all sorts of controls. We call them controls: the pointer, the button, the checkbox, checklist box, combo box, all sorts of controls. There are a lot of them you can use. The one we're interested in for now is the button. The button is what we're going to use for the buttons on our calculator. That's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the numbers, and the arithmetic buttons, the plus, minus, multiplication and division, and the equal sign. So I've just added one button. If you notice, let me just repeat that step. I clicked on the button, held on it, that's click and hold, and then drag onto the form. And if I release that, the button gets created on top of the form. The next thing we're going to need is, from the toolbox, we're going to need a text box. So we're just going to scroll down until we find text box. This is it. And I'll do the same thing. I'll click and hold and then drag onto the form, and I release it, and it creates my text box. Now if you notice, you can move these controls. Each control you can move to whatever position you want it. You can also resize it to the size you want. All these are properties of the control itself. Now let's start with the text box. I'll just drag it to the top and maybe just increase the width a bit, and I'll leave it like that. For the button, I'll just drag it in place. Now we're going to start looking at properties of objects. Now remember, in the first class we did, the one that we did in Java, we didn't do it in C#, we did it in Java, but if you remember, I told you the concept of object-oriented programming remains the same despite the language you're using. So the language here is C#, but it's still the same thing we're doing. This form that you see, this form itself is an object. Is an object of the form class. This text box is an object of the text box class. This button is an object of the button class. Now, all these objects have properties. They have properties. And how do you see their properties? Now, if we want to see the properties of this form, you click on the form. Now the form is highlighted. How do you know the form is highlighted? You see this little dotted lines around it. Do you notice the dotted lines around the form? That means the form is highlighted. Now when your form is selected or it's highlighted, if you go to the properties box, this is my properties box. I'll just drag it to display it a bit more. Under your properties box, you have two main tabs. There is the properties tab and there is the events tab. The events tab is the one that looks like a thunder. That's the events tab. And you have the properties tab. Now the properties tab is where you see all the properties of that object. Now the object is this form that we just created, and all its properties here. You can make changes in these properties. You can make these changes now, which takes effect even before the user starts running the application, or you can make changes in code. We'll see how we can make changes to some of these properties inside code. That's we call it runtime changes. So the property I want us to change for this form is this text at the top. You see, right now it's saying form 1, but we don't want it to show form 1. We want it to show Smart Calc. That's the name of our application. We want it to display on top of the form. Now this property is controlled by the text property. So if we go into the properties box of that form and look for the text property, this is the text property. You can see by default the text property is form 1. We'll just click there and change it to whatever we want. We want it to be Smart Calc. I'll just change that to Smart Calc. And after changing it, if you just click anywhere outside the properties box, it now changes the form. If you notice, the text on top of the form has been changed. What you've just done is you have changed the text property of this form object. So the next thing we want to do is we want to resize our button and also change the name that's displaying on that button, or the text that's displaying on that button. We don't want it to show button 1. We just want it to show 1. So first of all, we go to the properties window. That's after selecting the button. You click on the button to select it, and then you'll see in the properties window, in the text property, you change that to 1. That's just 1, and that will serve as our 1 button. Now what we're going to do for the other buttons is we'll just duplicate this button to create the other ones. So I'll just right click on that button and I'll select okay, we can copy and paste it. I'll just click on copy and then right click on the form and click on paste. Now it creates a duplicate for that button 1, but this one we don't want it to have 1 on it, so we'll go to the text property of that button and change it to 2. Now we have 1 and 2. I'll just keep repeating the same steps until I create all my buttons. So I'll just I'll hold on Control and press V, which means paste. That's the shortcut for paste. And I'll just select that and change that to 3. Control V, and I'll just put this underneath. Change that to 4. Control V, change that to 5. Control V, change that to 6. Control V, that's our 7. Control V, that's our 8. Control V, that's our 9. And finally for the buttons, that's for the number buttons, Control V, and I'll change that to 0. Good. So now we have our buttons for the calculator. I left a little space on the right here because I intend to put the arithmetic functions here. So we'll just do the same thing. The arithmetic buttons are just normal buttons. So we'll just paste the same button that we've been duplicating, but instead now of writing a number, we'll just change the text to a plus symbol. So that's going to be our plus arithmetic button. We'll do another Control V and change that to minus. Control V, change this one to multiplication. Now for the multiplication, I'll just type X. That looks more like a multiplication symbol to me. And finally for the division, Control V, we'll just change that. I'll just use a / for the division symbol. Then finally there's one more button I want to add, which is the reset button, and I'll make it a bit wider than the others, and I'll just change that to CE. That's just the reset button on a calculator. So now we have our full calculator GUI, but so far if you run the calculator, you notice that the user can't really do much in the application. If he clicks on the buttons, nothing happens. Why is it taking time to run? Okay, I have a few stuff running in the background. Okay, we'll probably have to wait for that to finish. Um, okay, finally it runs our calculator, and this is what I'm saying. So this is the calculator smart calc application running. If the user clicks on these buttons, nothing happens because we haven't written any code that will handle clicking of these buttons. Now, clicking of these buttons are known as events. So in order to handle these clicks, we have to handle click event of these buttons. One thing the user can do though is he can actually type into the text box, because the normal text box allows a user to type with the keyboard. So apart from that, the user can't really do anything. So let's just close that application and go back to the design view in order to improve and add more features. Now the first thing we want to do is if the user clicks on this one button, we want to add the number 1 to the stack of the text in this text box. Okay, before we do that, I think it's very good to keep everything kind of well named. What I mean by that is our text box should be given a good name that we can use. Our buttons should all have very good names that we can use. For instance, this is what I mean by that. If you click on this text box and you go to the properties of this text box and look for name, this is name. So the name of the text box is text box 1. Now we can leave it as text box 1 as we've been doing in the class, or we can give it a name that we want. For instance, we can call it display, but I think it's better to leave it as text box 1 just to avoid confusions, since we've been using text box 1 in our in the classes. So we'll leave the name as text box 1. For the buttons, for one button, I'd like to call it button 1. Okay, that's good. It's calling it button 1 already. For the button 2, it's calling it button 2. That's good. I'll just check to make sure all the buttons are well named. Button 3, button 4, button 5, button 6, button 7, button 8, button 9. Okay, this one is being called button 10. I don't like that. I'll just change that to button 0. So I'll just remove that one. Now, these are the names that you can reference inside code. If you call button 0, you are referring to this object, this particular 0 button object. So for the CE button, I would like to call that button CE, or perhaps let's call it CE button. CE, that's CE button. And I'll also like to change the names of these arithmetical symbol buttons. The plus, I'm going to change the name to plus button. The minus, I'll just click on it and go to the properties window and change the name to minus button. The multiplication, I'll just change the name to times button. And finally, the division, I'll change the name to divide button. So we now have good naming conventions for all the objects in our form. Now, the next thing we want to do is handle this click event of the one button. Now, I'll just show you how to do that. You double click on this one button and Visual Studio will write the code for you and actually link the event handler for you. So all you need to do after double clicking is provide the code for handling the clicking of this button. Now I'll just double click on it. So after double clicking, Microsoft Visual Studio has created the code for this one button event handler. Now notice what it does. It has created this method. If you remember methods in the first class we did, it has created a private avoid method, meaning it doesn't return anything, and it called the button1 underscore click, and then it has these properties which I feel you shouldn't worry about for now. I think we'll look at what they mean later when you get a better understanding of what we're doing. So this is the method. Visual Studio has not just written this code, it has also at the same time linked this method to the one button event handler. Now I'll demonstrate that for you, because the reason why I'm emphasizing on this is because I've seen where students just come into the form1.cs code, source code, and then just start typing exactly what they see in my own form1.cs source code. Now, if you just write this method, you have not linked it. That is why I always emphasize that students should double click on this button in order for Visual Studio to link it for them. Now, in case you haven't linked it, you just created the method, you can actually link it by yourself. Now, to do that, you go to the form design view and you click on the button, that's the one button, and then in the properties window, if you remember the events tab, the one that looks like a thunder, you click on it. Now, after you click on it, you see under the action, you'll see a click action. Now that is the event for clicking that button. And notice what Visual Studio has done for me now. It has added this button1 underscore click method in here. Initially this was empty, but by double clicking on that one, it created the button1 underscore click in my code and then added it here. So please take note. If you did write the code yourself, then make sure you come in here and enter the name of the method, button1 underscore click. Now let's go back to the code. If you remember, to get our text box, the name of our text box, that's this text box, is text box 1. Now we need to add a 1, that's a 1 number, to the stack of what is being displayed in this text box whenever the user clicks on this one. So to do that, inside the code, we'll just write text box 1 dot text. Now what we're doing is we're actually changing the text property, but runtime change. Remember what I said when we were changing the property of this form, this MathCalc, we changed the text property that in the properties box while before the user even starts using it. But in this case, what we're doing is we're changing the text property while the application is running. So this change will happen when the user clicks on the one button, and the change we're going to make is we're going to say text box 1 is equal to text box 1 dot text. That's text box 1 dot text is equal to whatever the contents of text box 1 is, and then add 1 stack. So let's just put a 1 there. Now you could put the 1 in quotes, which means it's a string, or you could just put 1. I think we've been using the numbers in the classes, so to avoid confusions, let's just use the 1. Now by just adding this, you have handled the button1 clicking event. Now we're going to test this. We'll just go back to the design view, click on play to start debugging it, and see what happens. Now in our calculator, if the user clicks on one, you can see one is being added to the stack of numbers. Now the other buttons will not work at the moment because you haven't handled them, but the process is exactly the same as you added this one. So I'll just quickly go ahead and add all the other and connect all the other number buttons. So I'll double click on 2, it creates the method, and I'll write text box 1.text is equal to text box 1.text plus 2. So notice we're still accessing the same text box 1 because we only have one text box, this one, and it is the one we're adding numbers to. So we'll go back to the design view, double click on 3, it creates the event handler, and we put in the same code, text box 1.text. Let me also mention that if you're doing this right, you will notice that Visual Studio will be giving you options for the properties. So what I mean by that is, if I write, instead of text box 1, I just write text box and press on the dot, the full stop, you see it doesn't give me options because there is nothing like text box in our design view. So make sure whenever you see you don't have options, when you write maybe a kind of what we call it, can't remember what, anyway, if you write the name of the variable, that's what I'm looking for. If you write the name of the variable, this text box 1 is just a variable that accesses this text box. Now if you write the name of variable and write the dot, and you notice you're not getting those options by Visual Studio, it means that's a hint you've missed something, either the spelling, perhaps maybe you wrote it in the B in a small letter. You see, it doesn't show the options, but if you write it correctly, you will get that option immediately you press the dot. That's a full stop symbol. So text box 1.text is equal to text box 1.text plus 3. We'll go back to the design view, connect the 4. I'll just copy this, Control C, Control V, and change this to 4. Go back to the design view for 5, Control V, change this to 5. 6, double click, Control V, change this to 6. Double click on 7, Control V, change this to 7. Double click on 8, Control V, change this to 8. 9, Control V, change this to 9. And finally for the numbers, double click, Control V, change that to 0. And now we'll just run our application to test and see if they're all running. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and finally 0. So all my buttons are working at this moment. I can the user can click the buttons and they get added to the stack. Now I think we should probably stop here in this second video, and we'll carry on for the operational buttons in the next class.